So in this video, we're going to take a look at the basics of market structures. And then there's one kind of last question that's thrown in here that I've seen sometimes on AP tests about HHI. So this allows us to kind of quickly identify a market based on a couple of key traits. So we'll start with perfect competition. And this one, there are many firms. And we sometimes would say like thousands would be a good explanation of this. But in theory, it would be enough that none of them can individually influence price or quantity in the market. So that's actually when we say that there are many firms, what that actually means. Control over price, therefore, would be none. Each firm is what we call price taker. So it's possible you'll see a phrase saying like this firm is a price taker. That means that they have to take the market price. So they have to take the market price as it is. They can't influence it. Types of goods that they sell are identical, and they are both in reality and in perception. So the implication of that is no ads, and then there's really no attempt to distinguish the product, because everybody who's a consumer knows that if you buy it from, Roy's farmer stand, then it's exactly the same as Ming's farmer stand. They're all the same. Barriers to entry would be none or very low, in the sense that it's low cost to shut down and low cost to start up. So businesses can freely enter and exit the market, is what we would say, that it's frictionless in theory. And this again is a theoretical kind of maximum of the most frictionless example of what a market is. And really, we don't really find perfectly competitive markets out there in the world. In fact, we find imperfectly competitive ones all the time. So the reality is much more like these three, which are what we collectively call imperfect competition. And they break some of these rules, right? Sometimes their goods aren't identical, or they have barriers to entry, or they can manipulate the price in some way. And that's where we're going to go next. So at the other extreme is a monopoly. And in that one, there is one firm, hence the name monopoly, so one seller. And we would say the potential for many, many buyers in that case. And we'll kind of go back and look later in this class about a monopsony, which would be one buyer as opposed to one seller. So monopoly is one seller. The control over price is significant here, or total in some sense, only limited by the demand for the product. So, the electric company is a good example of a monopoly in many places. They're still limited in what they can charge because of the demand for the product, right? So if you raise the price too high, you won't have any customers. The product that monopolies sell is unique to the market area. So that's critical, or else you wouldn't have a monopoly, because if you had multiple people selling the good, then it wouldn't be one seller. So we often don't see ads very much here, unless they're trying to maybe manipulate PR, that kind of stuff. So we sometimes do see that. Barriers to entry is very high, or in almost insurmountable. We would say very high cost to enter and to shut down as a firm. So otherwise, again, if we had relatively easier to enter and exit the market, monopolies wouldn't be monopolies very often or very long. And so sometimes, by the way, there's really two types here. And I'll kind of briefly outline that to say that there are artificial monopolies and then there are natural monopolies. And so we'll kind of look at the difference later, but they both behave the same way. Now let's look at oligopolies. So this would be few sellers, and this is maybe like under 8 or so, right? Under about 8. And there are few enough that their decisions affect the outcomes for the other firms. So that one, maybe I should actually specify, one or any of their decisions affect the outcomes for the other firms. And we call that idea interdependence. They have interdependence. They're dependent on each other. And they have significant control over price as well. But it is limited, be nice if I could spell here, limited by the payoff matrices of the other players. In other words, you might have some control over the price, but you also don't have total control over it, because you would want to do what's best for you based on what the other players are doing. So that idea of like, well, you don't get to entirely control it because your decision is being influenced by someone else. Types of goods are usually similar or identical. We often have quite similar products with oligopolies. It's rare to have really, really different ones. And so, I'm going to go ahead and put examples here in just a second. So this is like the electric company. And this would be, let me make a little space here. This up here, the common example here is a farmer's market. It's not great. Maybe the corn market in the United States would be a good one. So for oligopolies, usually if we're talking about a national level, big manufacturers like maybe aircraft manufacturers, the airline industry, cell phone providers, airlines, that sort of thing, car makers. But in a small town, right, you could have an oligopoly as well, right? Maybe if in a rural town you had only 2 stores that sold seeds and things like that, then you would have an oligopoly in those cases. So they sometimes will engage in product differentiation, but not always. Product differentiation is a fancy way of saying the category of things like ads, but it's bigger than that. It's them trying to differentiate their product in a variety of different ways, right? They could use rebate programs and loyalty programs and that sort of thing. There are high barriers to entry in most cases. It's difficult to enter or exist the market, but we wouldn't say it's nearly as high here. In the monopoly it's prohibitive. In some cases, it's literally against the law. Like the electric company, in many cases, is regulated to prevent it from exiting the market. But and in often cases, oligopolies are also highly regulated for that reason. Monopolistic is many firms, but here we're talking about between 10 and 100, in the hundreds, and enough that each is able to control price and quantity to some limited extent. And by far and away, this is quite common in the restaurant industry, the retail industry, that sort of thing. So retail and the restaurant industry. But the types of goods, right, and I'll switch back to control over price in a second, they're usually similar, but they're often differentiated by ads and loyalty programs and things like that. So, when we say the restaurant industry, we're saying, broadly speaking, all of the restaurants, or even Italian restaurants or something. They offer different products, different levels of service, all kinds of things. So they're similar, right? We can put them in a category, but they're not identical products, like cucumbers at a farmer's market. Control over price, it's limited, but it does exist. And it's limited by, again, the demand curve, and it's not particularly influenced by what the others do. So barriers to entry are low. It is costly to enter and exit, but not that difficult. So, it takes some time and cost to start a new restaurant or a retail store or something like that. But it's not impossible in most cases, right? So by far and away, when we talk about industries and things in the United States, we're often talking about monopolies, oligopolies, and monopolistic competition. Now, the last question on here is actually HHI. And HHI is, oh goodness, I knew I should have written this down. The Hirshman, oh boy, we're going to see if I can spell it, but this is not a spelling test. The Hirshman Herfindahl Index. I totally spelled that wrong. Spelling doesn't count. It measures the degree of market concentration. In other words, how far along are we on the spectrum of perfect competition to monopoly? So the HHI is the sum of the squares of the market shares of the companies in the industry. So, for example, 2 firms, 50% shares each. So that would be 50 squared, right? Plus 50 squared. And so we're going to see here if I can actually do math. You have 2,500 there, and you have 2,500 there. And so that gives you an HHI of 5,000. What if you had two firms with 99% share, 1% share? Well, so that would be 99 squared plus 1 squared, and that's 9801 plus 1. So I think if I did my math in my head right, is 9802. So it's a way of measuring, right? And the nice thing about the HHI is that this number gets bigger, you can see, if the market's more concentrated. And you can see that with two firms, 99% share, that's super close to a monopoly. And what would a monopoly be? One firm with 100% share, so 100 squared equals 10,000. So that's the maximum HHI. You're not going to be asked to necessarily say, well, the HHI is 1,200, so that's relatively low or relatively high. In general, in the real world, anything above probably 1,500 is actually pretty high. We'd say it's closer to oligopoly if it's above 1,500 or 2,000. And there are some industries that have quite high HHIs, and you could Google it, and there are some research studies that study what's the HHI in different industries. So at any rate, this is a measure of that market concentration. So generally speaking, HHI over probably 2,000. So 2,000 plus would be pretty clearly an HHI there. This would be 10,000 HHI because that's in the closer you get to it. And this is more like under maybe 1,500 HHI. And perfect competition, right, would have a really, really small HHI in that sense, because each of the market shares is going to be tiny. But we'd say maybe even under like 300 HHI would be pretty close to that. So, and these are not hard and fast, right? I'm like under 1,500 and then 2,000 and up. Well, you're on the border. So hopefully this lesson has helped you. I'll see you next time.